Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you would love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. I was driving the I-5 one night the way people drive when they're tired of their own thoughts, with the hum of the wheels turning into a kind of dull heartbeat and the long black ribbon of California highway unspooling so steadily that you start to forget the world has edges. I'd been on the road for hours already, moving south toward Los Angeles after visiting my cousin in Sacramento, and the plan had been simple: music low, window cracked, gas station coffee, make it to my apartment before sunrise. But highways at night are strange, living things, and sometimes when you're too tired or too distracted or too willing to let the dark hold you, the road stops feeling like a road and starts feeling like something that breathes with you. The I-5 does that more than most. It's long and lonely in ways people don't talk about: flat land stretching on forever, truck stops that come and go like mirages, headlights appearing and disappearing like tiny controlled stars. It's the kind of place where, if something wanted to follow you, it would never have to hide. It would just have to match your speed. The first odd thing that happened that night was the way the exit signs changed. I'd taken the highway so many times I could picture the order of exits without looking at my GPS. I knew where the next rest stop should be, which farm roads branched off, where the long empty stretches were. But sometime past midnight, after I'd passed Kettleman City, I realized the names weren't lining up. Instead of the familiar sequence, I kept seeing the same sign again and again: Old Canyon Road, 2 miles. It looked like any other reflective green sign, clear white letters, nothing strange. But it shouldn't have been there. Not directly on the I-5. Not repeated. At first I assumed I was tired, that maybe I'd just misread the previous one. But then it came again. And again. And then a fourth time. Same distance. Same font. Same angle of the signpost. Same tiny crack in the reflective paint on the tow. The highway was repeating itself. I tried to shake it off. Rolled down the window. Let the cold air slap my face. Drank more of the burnt gas station coffee that tasted like chemicals and impatience. But the road kept unfurling in long, identical stretches, like someone had copy-pasted the same piece of asphalt. Every set of headlights behind me felt like the same car. Every stretch of farmland looked like the same abandoned field. The line between déjà vu and dread thinned into something sharp. The second strange thing happened when the radio died, not suddenly, but like it was being pulled underwater, the music stretching, slowing, losing clarity until the words in the song weren't words anymore but long vowels smeared across static. I switched stations. Same thing. I turned it off. The silence was loud enough to feel like it was pushing against my ears. I don't know how long I drove like that, with the road repeating itself, the signs looping, the dark pressing inward, but eventually I saw something on the shoulder that made my stomach tighten. A man. Walking. Alone. At nearly 1 a.m. On a highway miles from anything. At first I thought he was homeless, or maybe a stranded driver walking toward help, but something about the way he moved made that explanation fail. He walked with a steadiness that didn't match the cold or the dark or the isolation. As if he'd been walking for a long time and didn't need rest. As if he knew exactly where he was going and why. As if the night was familiar to him. The closer I got, the more wrong he looked. Not because his shape was strange, he looked completely normal from a distance, but because he didn't react to the sound of my car approaching. People always react to cars on empty highways. They turn their heads, shift their shoulders, do something. He didn't move at all, didn't turn, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge me. He just kept walking in that steady, unbroken line, the same rhythm as the white dashes on the road. I passed him with attention crawling up my arms, and when I glanced at the mirror, expecting to see his figure shrink behind me, I saw nothing. He was gone, just the road, empty, silent, black. My chest tightened with that awful, childlike fear, the instinctive one that whispers run but you don't know where. For a few miles I tried to convince myself that exhaustion was messing with me. It had been a long day. Too much thinking, too much caffeine, too little sleep. But then I saw the sign again. Old Canyon Road, 2 miles. Same crack in the bow. Same angle, same lighting. The exact same sign I had already passed 5 times. And then, the man walking again, same pace, same posture, same distance from the shoulder. Same everything. The highway wasn't looping. Something had me in its rhythm. Something had matched my speed, something was keeping me. I didn't slow, didn't speed up, I just drove with my hands clenched on the steering wheel, breathing too fast. The GPS map froze, the little blue arrow stuck in place even though the car was moving. The road ahead blurred into a kind of tunnel vision, and the air inside the car felt suddenly warmer, like someone had exhaled from the back seat. I didn't look, I couldn't. The third strange thing happened when the headlights ahead appeared, small at first, distant, like another car approaching, but as the lights grew brighter, I realized they weren't approaching at all. They were stationary, a parked car, on the shoulder. Hazard lights blinking. Relief hit me, finally something normal. But when I slowed and pulled closer, the relief drained out of me so fast it felt like a punch. It was my car, my same make, my same model, same dent on the rear bumper, same hanging air freshener in the mirror, same scratch on the left headlight, my exact car. Parked on the shoulder, empty. Hazard lights blinking a steady, patient heartbeat into the dark. I drove past it, heart pounding, and the moment it disappeared behind me, the radio turned on by itself. No music, no static, just breathing, slow human, inside the car. I slammed the volume to 0 but the breathing didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore, it was coming from the back seat. I don't know how long I kept driving like that, not looking back, barely breathing, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers went numb, but eventually the GPS blinked back to life. The map shifted, the road ahead changed, and for the first time in hours, the exit sign was different. Ridgeline exit, 1 mile. I didn't care where it led, I just needed off. When I took the exit, the air snapped back to its normal temperature. The radio went silent, the breathing stopped, the map corrected itself. And the road behind me, when I looked in the mirror, looked like any ordinary highway at night, empty, dark, quiet. I drove to a small diner off the old road and sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, shaking so badly I spilled half the coffee I bought. When I finally worked up the nerve to look at my car, truly look, there were fingernail marks on the inside of the back window. Long ones, dragged across the glass. I didn't drive the I-5 at night again for months. When I finally did, in full daylight, everything looked normal, the fields, the bridges, the long strip of asphalt running south. But somewhere between Kettleman City and Bakersfield, out of habit, I looked toward the shoulder, and for just a second, only a blink, I saw him again. The man walking, same pace, same posture, and I swear he turned his head this time. Just slightly, just enough to let me know he remembered me, just enough to let me know the road still had a place for me if I ever drifted too far into its rhythm again. Even after I finally reached the diner and convinced myself I was safe, something about the night felt unfinished, like the road had let me go not because I escaped but because it had paused, the way a predator pauses when it's had enough for now but remembers the taste. I kept thinking about the parked version of my car, the perfect copy, hazard lights blinking patiently. If it had been real, someone would have seen it. If it had been a hallucination, I would have noticed something off. But it wasn't either, it was deliberate, placed there with a precision that felt almost instructional, like the highway was trying to teach me what it could do if it wanted. And the more I sat there, the more I realized something was still wrong. The diner windows were too reflective. Every time I blinked, I caught a shape behind me in the glass, not moving, not changing, just waiting. At first I told myself it was the way fluorescent lights distort angles, but the longer I stared, the more the reflection began to separate itself from my silhouette. A head turned a fraction too slowly, a shoulder shifted in a way my body didn't, and in the dim shine of the window, the reflection's eyes looked darker than mine, like two tunnels punched into the glass. I spun around, nothing. Just the empty booth and the hum of an old refrigerator in the corner. But when I turned back to the window, the reflection wasn't mine anymore. It stood a little farther back, in the angle where the diner's light couldn't reach. Taller, shoulders too straight, a shape that shouldn't have been part of me. And for a faint second, the hazard lights of that other car, the one on the shoulder, blinked in sync across the reflection, even though my real car outside wasn't blinking anymore. I left the diner without finishing the coffee. I didn't want to sit with any glass between me and the dark again. When I got into my car, the engine hesitated before turning over, like it was listening. And when I pulled onto the road, everything inside the vehicle felt slightly shifted, my seat set a little farther back, my mirror angled to catch more of the back seat than the road, my air freshener turned toward the passenger side instead of me. Someone had touched things, not violently, not to frighten, but to measure. The drive home was quiet, straight, uneventful, exactly what I had wanted hours earlier. But the feeling didn't fade. I knew, the same way you know you're being watched even when no one's around, that the highway hadn't finished with me. It had simply let me go long enough for the world to start feeling real again. Because sometimes the road keeps a copy of you. Sometimes it follows, and sometimes, when the night is long and the stretch of asphalt is too quiet, you feel a car behind you in your mirror that matches your speed a little too perfectly. With headlights that brighten at the same time your breath does. And you know the road hasn't forgotten you. It's just waiting for you to come back tired enough to listen again. I moved into that suburb because I wanted silence that meant something, not the artificial hush of city apartments with thin walls and neighbors who argued through the vents, but the kind of silence that feels earned, like a blanket pulled over a place that has agreed to rest. The street I lived on pretended to be that kind of place. Rows of similar houses, soft porch lights at dusk, sprinklers that ran on timers so precise they almost sounded like breath. And for the first few months I let myself believe the street was harmless, a small corner fenced neatly away from whatever the rest of California worried about. The Rawlings house sat directly across from mine, and it blended into the neighborhood's quiet so well that I barely noticed it. Pale blue shutters, a porch that sagged politely under its own age. Curtains that always seemed 1 degree too thick for the windows. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth thinking about. I passed it every day the same way you pass a lamppost, without giving a single piece of yourself to it. Until the night it stayed awake when everything else slept. I remember coming home from a late shift and seeing the house glowing like someone had turned it inside out and stuffed it with white fire. Not warm yellow incandescence, not the scattered glow of lamps left on by accident. This was a harsh, flat light that filled every room with equal intensity, a clinical brightness that felt less like illumination and more like an announcement. It stopped me before I even turned into my driveway. Every window was a white rectangle, too smooth to be natural, too steady to be human. Houses are allowed to be awake sometimes, but they should not look aware. The Rawlings went to bed early every night without fail, their porch light usually clicked off at 10 like a ritual. But on this night the porch light was swallowed in a glare pouring from every upstairs and downstairs window. I told myself there had to be a reason, an emergency, a mistake. A bulb shorting, but even from the outside I could feel something was wrong with the air around it. Like the house wasn't just lit, it was listening. Inside my own home I tried pulling the blinds shut, but the brightness poured through each gap, slicing my ceiling into hazy stripes. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I finally gave up and went to the window with that familiar mix of irritation and unease. I lifted the blinds with 2 fingers. The house stared back blankly, and that blankness would have been easier to bear if not for the figure in the upstairs window. A tall shape, still as a photograph, no sway of shoulders, no tilt of the head, not even the subtlest shift of weight. People can't hold themselves that motionless. People are full of tiny betrayals, breaths, twitches, small corrections the body insists on. But the thing standing in that window had none of those. It was the kind of stillness that belonged to statues or mannequins or something being held in place by an attention I didn't want to understand. The next night all the lights were on again. More precise this time, almost sharper, as if the house had been corrected overnight. And there were two shapes in the window now, one slightly taller, one shorter, standing side by side, both facing outward. I watched them too long, long enough for the stillness to become a message. Long enough to understand the figures were not mannequins because mannequins don't lean a fraction closer when they know they're being observed. I stepped back from the blinds so quickly the cord clicked against the frame. You learn something about fear when it comes slow instead of sudden. Sudden fear breaks like glass, slow fear seeps like water. For days I tried pretending the house wasn't rewriting its rules. But every night at the exact same time, 12:03 a.m., the lights came on all at once, and every night the figures stood a little closer to the glass. Like they were being pulled forward by the weight of the brightness behind them. Not dramatically, not enough to be obvious, but enough for someone who had already started measuring the distances. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom after the fourth night. The glow made the walls breathe, the silence outside thickened into something that had shape. I slept on the couch, or pretended to. Every noise had a direction now, the hum of my refrigerator, the settling of the wood frame, the distant groan of a car on a faraway street. Through all of it, the one sound I waited for was the click of the Rawlings porch light. But the porch light never came on again, only the unnatural whiteness. One morning, after a night of half-dreams and shallow breaths, I found a small folded paper under my windshield wiper. It was damp from dew, only one word was written inside in shaky, deliberate pencil, watching. No envelope. No explanation, just the word, like a diagnosis. The Rawlings didn't answer the door when I knocked. Their lawn looked untouched, their porch undisturbed, their mailbox empty. It was as if they had moved without moving, like the house had quietly swallowed them. For 3 days the house stayed dark again. I allowed myself to hope that something had reset itself. But on the fourth night I woke at 2:17 a.m. without knowing why. There was no sound, not even the scraping of branches outside. Just a pull. A feeling like someone had said my name from far away. I went to the window, slowly, carefully, I lifted the blinds a few inches. The house was lit again, but dimmer this time, like the brightness had grown tired but remained determined. And in the upstairs window stood 3 shapes now. The tallest one pressed close to the glass, face nearly touching it. The other 2 slightly behind, arranged the way people arrange themselves when waiting for an instruction. And then something happened I still don't know how to explain. The figure closest to the glass raised its hand, not in a wave, not in greeting, but in a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. As if checking whether my attention was still intact. My breath caught and held itself hostage in my chest. I dropped the blinds and stepped back into the hallway, hands shaking. I didn't go near the window again that night. I sat against the wall until the first gray light of morning softened the room. But even in daylight my house felt subtly rearranged, like someone had walked through it very gently while I slept, my coat angled on its hook, the salt shaker moved 2 inches from where I always left it, the bathroom door slightly less open than I remembered. 2 days later the Rawlings house finally went dark. Completely, no porch light, no upstairs glow, no faint leak of brightness. It stood like a thing that had exhaled all at once and gone still. I should have felt relief, I didn't. Because the night after the darkness returned, I woke at 3:11 a.m. with a familiar pressure in the air, a soft awareness pressed against the edges of my sleep. I sat up slowly, afraid of what I already knew. The light was coming from my living room. Not bright, not harsh, just a faint, steady white glow seeping under the door the way a whisper seeps under breath. And somewhere behind that glow, I felt it. The certainty that what once stood across the street, had simply found a shorter distance to travel. I didn't move for a long time after realizing the glow was inside my own house. There are moments in life where fear doesn't strike you like lightning but settles over you like a slow, heavy coat, one sleeve at a time, and by the time you understand what it is, your whole shape has changed. That night, sitting in the hallway with that thin white light pooling silently beneath the living room door, I felt myself shrinking into a version of me that existed before I had any explanation for darkness. There was a hum under the floorboards, faint and measured, like someone walking with the weight of their steps spread evenly across planks I'd never heard make noise before. I stared at the strip of light as if it might blink or shift. It didn't. It only continued leaking in a steady, unnatural band that reminded me of the Rawlings windows across the street, too smooth, too white, too calm to belong to anything electrical. I should have called someone. A friend, a neighbor, the police, anyone. But there's a strange truth about moments when the world begins to warp. You don't reach outward. You fold inward. You listen to the oldest instinct inside you, the one that says stay still, stay quiet, let it pass. So I stayed where I was, back pressed to the wall, palms damp against the floor, watching the light while my heartbeat kept time with the silence. At some point, I don't know when, the glow dimmed by a degree so subtle it could have been my own eyes adjusting. Then another degree, then another. The air shifted, not colder or warmer, but thinner, like something had pulled its weight away from the room. When the last sliver of light disappeared, the darkness felt heavier than the light had. It sat on the house in a way that made me realize light had never been the threat, the light had been the signal. The warning, the attention. I stayed awake until dawn, exhaustion hanging from my bones like wet fabric. Only when the first weak sunlight touched the edge of the curtains did I finally stand and open the living room door. The room was exactly as I had left it. Except for one thing. My blinds were open, wide open. Not pushed aside, not gently parted, fully drawn up to the very top, exposing the entire window to the street. I never left them open at night, and the way the morning sun hit the glass made me see something else, faint, almost invisible shapes on the surface. Smudges. Not fingerprints, not handprints either, just odd patches of condensation, as if something had leaned close to the glass not with hands but with the suggestion of a face. I didn't clean it, I didn't even touch it, I just sat on the edge of the couch with the blinds fully raised, staring at the street as if expecting the Rawlings house to light up again. But it didn't, it sat dark and blank, its shutters closed like eyelids resting after a long night of attention. For the next few days nothing happened. No lights, no figures, no strange sounds. The house fell back into its ordinary rhythm. I almost convinced myself that the glow in my living room had been some odd reflection, a passing car, a distant security light, a trick of half-sleep. But the mind is a poor liar when it has seen something true, and mine refused to settle. On the fifth night I decided to sleep in the living room, not out of courage but out of a tired resignation that comes from expecting something to return. I left a lamp on, the soft yellow one that made shadows harmless. Around 1:40 a.m., as I was drifting into that shallow place between consciousness and dreaming, I heard it. The faintest sound of shifting weight. Not footsteps, not creaks, just repositioning, like someone quietly settling into a chair across the room. I didn't open my eyes, sometimes opening your eyes feels like an invitation. And I didn't want to invite anything, not anymore. I lay there, breathing slowly, listening to the sound of a presence that was trying not to make noise but was not quite good enough at pretending to be nothing. After a long while, the lamp flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Not violently, just the uncertain fluttering of a bulb deciding whether or not to stay alive. And in that flicker, something in the room shifted again. A soft, barely there pressure in the air, like someone leaning forward. I opened my eyes despite myself. The room was empty, but the lamp was no longer where I had left it. It had been pulled 3 inches closer to the couch, leaving a small trail in the dust on the side table. Someone, something, had moved it. The next morning I checked the blinds again, closed, but the faint condensation marks had changed shape slightly. Not erased, not repeated, just altered, as if something had pressed against the glass in a new way. A different angle, a different watcher. The Rawlings house remained dark, but I stopped trusting its darkness. Sometimes at night, when I walked past the window, I felt a weight of attention pressing back from the glass, a quiet, patient awareness that didn't belong to me. One night, nearly a week after the living room incident, I woke up with an ache in my head, a deep pulse like something had been tapping just behind my thoughts. I sat up, disoriented, and saw a small folded paper on the floor near the foot of my bed. I didn't remember hearing anything, didn't remember anything being placed there. But the paper waited, patient and unassuming. I opened it, the same shaky pencil. The same deliberate handwriting. Closer. That was it, just that one word. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Fear doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers and waits. And I understood, finally, that whatever had watched me from across the street had removed the last bit of distance it once respected. It wasn't watching from its window anymore. It wasn't calling from across the dark. It wasn't sending warnings through the brightness of another house. It was inside mine, and it had no reason to leave. I started visiting the old Firewatch Tower because the city felt too crowded with its own noise, the kind of noise that doesn't always come from traffic or people but from the constant press of expectations. The small chatter of half-finished thoughts that follow you everywhere. Up north, past the last set of towns that still pretended to be suburbs, the forest rises in slow, dignified slopes, and at the top of one of those slopes stands a tower that looks like it's been waiting far longer than any of us have been alive. The first time I drove up there, the air tasted like pine and distance, and the silence had layers to it, like water so deep you couldn't guess what lived at the bottom. The tower had that same depth, a square wooden room perched on long, metal legs, creaking politely whenever the wind changed its mind. I climbed the stairs my first evening there and found an old wooden desk, a rusted compass nailed to a post, and a logbook with names stretching back decades. I didn't expect anything except quiet, so I wrote my name and the date the way everyone did, a small offering to a place that didn't need introductions. When I closed the logbook, a slip of paper fluttered out, folded twice, edges yellowing as if held too long in the wrong hands. On it, written in neat pencil, was a time, 3:11 a.m. Nothing else, no name, no date, just that hour. I laughed it off, the way you laugh off things you don't want to carry with you, and I went back down the stairs and drove home through the dark with the smell of pine still clinging to my jacket. But that night I woke up at exactly 3:11 a.m., not gently, not drifting, as if someone had tapped the inside of my skull with a knuckle. My room was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels curated, and for a moment I thought I saw the faintest glow of something behind my curtains, not bright, not intrusive, just a suggestion of light where there shouldn't have been any. When I pulled the curtain back, there was nothing there except a stillness that felt too deliberate. The next morning I drove back to the tower, not to look for answers but to see if the place felt different when approached with questions. And maybe it did, or maybe I did, because the tower seemed to be listening. Some spaces have that ability, they wait for you to return not because they miss you, but because they recognize you've started noticing. I climbed again, slower this time, and when I opened the logbook the slip of paper was gone. In its place, tucked where my name had been written the day before, was a new note with one word, witness. That word pressed itself into me in a way time couldn't soften. I sat at the small desk and looked out across the valley, watching the afternoon light bend around the tree line like it was making room for something. Hours passed without sound except the occasional sigh of wind against the tower's supports. At dusk the forest darkened into layered silhouettes, and by nightfall the valley had become a black lake with pockets of silver scattered across it. I should have gone home. But I stayed because sometimes silence bids you to sit a little longer, and sometimes silence is the only thing honest enough to trust. At 3:11 a.m. the tower groaned, not the casual shift of wood expanding, but a slow, deliberate creak that traveled up the metal legs in a rippling sequence. The desk trembled just enough for the corner of the logbook to lift. I told myself the wind had changed direction, but the air was still. And then, without warning, a lantern I hadn't noticed before, an old brass thing hanging from a nail, flickered to life with a warm, trembling flame. No spark, no match, just ignition. A soft, steady glow filling the room like breath. I didn't dare touch it, I only stood there listening to the forest lean in, because that's what it felt like, the trees themselves shifting slightly to hear what came next. And then I realized I wasn't alone. Not in the normal sense, not with footsteps or voices, but with presence. Something was occupying the same stillness I was, not pressing against me, not threatening, just acknowledging me. In the corner of the tower, where the shadows gathered deepest, something shifted its shape, not a person, not even a figure, but the absence of light rearranging itself in slow, thoughtful motions, as if deciding how visible it wanted to be. The lantern flickered once, as though greeting whatever had entered the room, and the flame lengthened by an inch. My throat tightened, my hands went numb, the shadow seemed to consider me, to tilt its head in a gesture that wasn't human but carried the rhythm of curiosity. And then, with that same slow intention, it moved closer to the lantern. Not touching it, just aligning itself with the glow like someone stepping into their rightful place after being gone too long. I backed toward the stairs without making a sound. Some instincts don't need language, they are old as bone. When my foot touched the top step, the lantern dimmed, just slightly, as if marking my departure. I didn't run down the stairs, running would have been too loud. I walked with careful, reverent steps until I reached my car, and only when I shut the door did the fear finally crest and break in my chest. For the next 3 nights the tower showed up in my dreams. Not as a building, not as a place, but as an expectation, a door left open in the mind that something moved through without permission. Each time I dreamt it, the lantern's glow reached a little farther into the dark, and each time I woke, my clock read 3:11 a.m. I wasn't alone in the dreams. I felt the presence again, softer now, patient, almost relieved, like it had waited too long for someone to return. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but the tower didn't believe me. And on the 4th night, when I woke again at 3:11 with the sensation that someone was quietly climbing a ladder just outside the edges of my thoughts, I understood that leaving would only delay what the place had already decided to show me. I returned to the tower not out of bravery but out of a quiet exhaustion with fear, the kind that makes you realize running only stretches the distance between you and whatever follows. Sometimes it's better to walk straight toward the thing that has started recognizing your shape. The road up the ridge felt different this time. The air had a clarity to it that wasn't entirely natural, and the trees seemed to lean slightly inward over the dirt path, as if guiding me with an etiquette they rarely bothered offering anyone else. When I reached the clearing, the tower stood with the same patient posture, but the shadows around its legs felt heavier, like something had thickened the darkness there. I climbed the stairs slower than before, every step a soft negotiation with whatever waited above. The lantern was already lit when I reached the top. It shouldn't have been, it was barely past midnight. Its flame burned lower this time, trembling like a held breath, and the room felt warmer than before, as if someone had been there for hours. The logbook lay open on the desk, its pages gently moving even though there was no wind. When I stepped closer, the ink on the latest line wasn't just fresh, it was still drying, the letters swollen with dampness. I leaned in and felt the warmth coming off the page as if the words themselves were alive. The line read, "You came back, good." And beneath that, as if added as an afterthought, "SIT." There are moments when obedience doesn't feel like surrender, it feels like inevitability. I sat, the room creaked softly, almost approvingly. Outside, the huge valley breathed in its slow, endless rhythm, and I watched the darkness shift like something large and unhurried was moving under its surface. When the air thinned behind me, I didn't turn. Turning felt unnecessary, whatever had joined me wasn't trying to hide. Instead, it stood near the far wall, a shape without definition, the absence of light arranged into a posture that suggested familiarity rather than threat. I could feel the weight of its attention, not pressing against me but settling near me, like someone sitting across from you in a dim room simply because they don't want you to be alone in whatever truth you're about to face. The lantern dimmed slightly, and in the softened glow I saw, with the faintest clarity, that the shadow had a subtle tilt to its head, the same way a person tilts when they're listening intently. I realized, in a slow, heavy way, that the tower was not haunted by something left behind, it was inhabited by something that had stayed deliberately. Something that had taken the job of watching long after the people assigned to the duty had gone. I opened the logbook slowly. Some entries were old, some were smudged, some names repeated over decades. But between the familiar signatures, new lines had appeared, faint, handwritten phrases filling spaces where no one had written before. Found it, returned, she remembered. Another, the boy came back with his own memory missing, cost paid. And then one near the bottom of the page, written lightly but urgently, someone must witness the exchange. The tower wasn't keeping records, it was keeping accounts. I suddenly felt the weight of the knot in my pocket, the small coil of twine left for me on that earlier night, and as soon as I touched it, the shadow shifted again, as if acknowledging something I hadn't even decided yet. The lantern brightened for a moment, the flame stretching upward like it was drawn toward whatever truth hung between us, and then the shadow moved for the first time with intention. It drifted, not walked, toward the opposite window, its form thinning and sharpening as it aligned itself with the glass. The window pane was a dark mirror, and in it I saw not the shadow's reflection but a memory I had forgotten I'd misplaced long ago, a face, tired, familiar, standing in the doorway of a childhood home I had left behind without ever fully closing. The memory wasn't bright or dramatic, it was ordinary, painfully ordinary, a moment I didn't know I had lost until it reappeared in that glass. My throat tightened, the shadow seemed to nod, and then I understood what the tower wanted from me. Or rather, what it had been preparing me for. The lantern flickered again, and in that flicker I heard something outside, a distant, desperate cry somewhere down the ridge. Not an animal, not a shout for help, something softer. A sound that belonged to loss rather than danger. The shadow moved toward the window with a slow pull, as though watching for the next part of whatever story had brought me here. Outside, a small light sparked between the trees, the beam of a flashlight, trembling, unfocused. Someone was coming up the trail, someone grieving, someone searching. The shadow turned toward me, not with urgency but with expectation. The time had come to witness. That was the tower's purpose, not to haunt, not to warn, but to hold the moments people had dropped along the way and return them only when someone was willing to stand beside the return. When the flashlight beam finally reached the clearing, a woman appeared, breathless, shaking, clutching a folded photograph to her chest. She looked up at the tower with a kind of pleading recognition, the way a person looks at the last place they hoped might still give them something back. I opened the door at the top of the stairs and called down softly. She climbed, slow and unsure, as though afraid the tower might vanish if she moved too quickly. When she reached the platform, she held the photograph out with trembling hands. "It's all I have left," she whispered. "Just this, everything else. I don't even know what I'm missing anymore." The shadow moved closer to her, not touching, not frightening, simply existing near enough to be felt. The lantern flame grew taller. The woman inhaled sharply, and for a long, fragile moment the air in the tower felt like a held breath. Then the photograph in her hands rippled gently. Not the paper, the memory attached to it. Something inside her shifted, like a puzzle piece returning to a place she didn't know had been empty. She gasped, and tears ran down her cheeks. "I remember," she whispered. "God. I remember her laugh. But the tower's exchanges are balanced." I watched as her expression flickered with a small, subtle confusion. "What street did we live on?" she asked suddenly. What was the number on the mailbox?" The detail had vanished, paid into the ledger. A small cost for a precious return. The shadow withdrew slowly, its purpose finished. The lantern dimmed, the air softened. The woman hugged me, strangers in the world but bound by the smallest miracle, and then she returned down the trail with her photograph held like a newborn truth. When I turned back into the room, the shadow was nearly gone, thinning into the corners like breath fading from a mirror. The logbook lay open again, waiting for me. I picked up the pencil, my hand steadier than I expected, and wrote the only thing that felt honest: "I witnessed, I return what I can." The lantern's flame softened in approval. As I walked down the stairs, the sky beginning to pale with the first hint of morning, I realized something simple and terrifying: the tower hadn't called me because I was special. It had called because it needed someone who wouldn't look away when the cost came due. And I knew, with a kind of dreadful certainty, that it would call again. I never planned to stop at that gas station. It was one of those little islands the highway leaves behind where the desert hums in a patient tone and reminds you that people still move through its wide ribs. I was heading east, trying to put a week of small defeats behind me, the sun already bruised into the horizon and the long ribbon of road ahead thinning into suggestion. The fuel light blinked like a polite alarm and, because sometimes you listen to small alarms. I eased off the highway where the station squatted beneath its tired neon sign. Up close, it looked smaller than the map, squat and flaking like something the desert allowed to remain as a mercy. The pumps leaned in the dust, 3 of them, each with the stubborn dignity of objects that have been used and then abandoned, and the convenience store behind them glowed weakly in the gloom as if embarrassed to be awake. Inside the lights buzzed and a fan whirred, and the clerk, a man with the tired face that desert jobs make, nodded at me without a word. There were shelves of things that had no business existing after dark, canned goods with dates that looked like history, postcards of sunsets that everyone pretended to remember better than they did, novelty sunglasses that refracted the fluorescent. I bought water, because buying it felt like an action I could control, and when I stepped back out the air had dropped 3 degrees and the sky had settled into a depth I could almost drown in. That's when I saw him, a figure at the far pump who hadn't been there when I came in. He wore a long coat that sat wrong on him, not flapping in the wind like it should but hanging in a stillness that made my skin prickle. He faced the highway as if listening, shoulders still, head turned slightly, the posture of someone who expects something to cross the road exactly when it ought. In distance he was only a silhouette, but silhouettes in the desert have a way of holding more than shadow, they hold patience, and the desert loves patience. I got into my car to check the map, to give myself the plausible excuse of being practical, and when I tried to start the engine the dash gave a little cough and died. The radio spat static like a throat clearing. At the same moment the man at the pump turned his head in the slow, deliberate movement of someone acknowledging a presence, and I noticed beneath the car a darkness that didn't sit like the rest of the night. It was too long, too taut, a shadow stretched into something that felt like intent. The man raised one finger and pointed, not toward the pumps this time but down, at that wrong shadow, and the gesture landed on me like a cold verdict. I walked back toward the store because walking felt better than sitting in a car and waiting for something unseen to decide my fate. When I pushed the door open the clerk slammed it shut behind me and locked both latches with a quick, practiced motion. The lights went low, too low for comfort, and the humming fluorescence gave way to a thinner glow from a back freezer. He didn't look like the type who believed in stories, yet the way he moved had the economy of someone who had rehearsed his responses for a long time. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said without accusation. His voice had been smoothed by too many late nights, but the words cut clear through the low hum of the store. I tried to laugh it off, to say the engine had stalled, that practical things were the only plausible things, but he didn't let me. He reached under the counter and, without asking, put a small coil of twine in my hand, a thing so ordinary it felt ceremonial. "Keep it," he said. "Keep witness." I didn't know whether to be insulted or grateful, instead I swallowed and wrapped my fingers around the twine because in places that insist on silence, small knots feel like promises. He pointed, with the edge of his chin, toward the window, where something moved with an indecent patience, a smear along the glass that had the slow geometry of a hand dragged in wet ink. The man by the pump was closer now, impossibly closer, though I had not heard footsteps. The desert rearranged itself while you blinked, it has that kind of memory. We waited in the dimness and the sound outside changed to a dragging. At first I thought it was a truck, then I realized it was the ground itself shifting, the gravel pulled like tidewater along the foundation of the store. You learn quickly that the desert does not need to shout to be dangerous. It arranges, it tests. The clerk, his face lit briefly by freezer light, told me in a hollow whisper that sometimes the road brings back lost things and sometimes it brings back people with the wrong instructions attached. He said it as if he had said it 1,000 times, as if the sentence itself was part of the job, watching the place people pretend they can pass through untouched. "He's not what he seems," the clerk said finally, "but he's the marker. He shows you the boundary." He tapped the window where the smear darkened, and when I looked more closely I saw an impression, the suggestion of digits, long and unnerving, dragging down the glass. It wasn't a hand, not in any way my hands were hands, it was the memory of a hand, the idea of one, and it ran cold in my mouth. The next minutes moved like slow film. The drag outside paused, resumed, circled the building as if considering intestine routes. At one point the man in the coat, if indeed he was a man, stepped up onto the island where the pump stood and bowed his head slightly, like he was acknowledging an old debt. He lifted his face to the night for the barest moment and I glimpsed the features, pale, almost washed of blood, eyes that did not catch the light. He pointed toward me as if offering a last courtesy and then, the way a tide moves away when it decides to be polite, he turned and melted into the high dark. For a second I thought I could breathe again. That relief lasted as long as the echo of his movement. Then there came a soft tapping at the back door, patient, polite, and the ache of imminent wrongness pooled behind my ribs. The clerk took my elbow, led me into the narrow storage room, and closed the door only enough to keep the light and the window out of sight. He did not lock it, he said locks were declarations, declarations invite attention. We sat in that small, cramped darkness and the clerk told me the story of the last passenger like a person reciting a confession. He said people stop for water, for a stretch, or because their headlights give out, and sometimes they leave with less than they came in with and sometimes they leave with more, but the desert keeps count in ways the government doesn't. He spoke of tokens, an old watch returned to a man who then could not remember his wife's laugh, a child's toy coming back and the name of the street where his father grew up slipping like a pebble from a shoe. The returns, he said, are precise, the costs are petty and private. Accepting something the desert gives you is agreeing to a ledger, he said. You sign even if you don't know it. He tied his words with more care than I had expected, and when he reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out a photo the edges were soft with handling, it was a cracked picture of the highway in daylight and somebody had scrawled beside it in faded ink, "Do not stop after 10." He'd never noticed the ink until that night, or perhaps he had chosen not to see it. The warning pressed into me like a thing on my chest. At some point the store lights fluttered and brightened again for a heartbeat, and in that thin clarity I saw the glass move as if something wet and patient had pressed against it and then withdrawn. The clerk's jaw worked around the words he didn't say. "The man at the pump is the last passenger," he murmured. "Not the hunter, not the hunger, he's the sign that the desert is marking its border. He stands and waits and points. If you follow that point because you think you can control it, you get counted." I asked the obvious, why does the man appear? Why does anything move like that in a place with so much silence? He shrugged the kind of shrug that comes from long years of practice. "The desert remembers," he said simply. "It remembers the things people leave behind, and sometimes it's generous. Sometimes it's tidy. But it measures generosity with what it thinks you can pay." When he slid a small paper cup of coffee toward me, the steam circled up in the dim like a small, temporary halo. I drank it faster than was polite. The clerk pushed my keys toward me with a hand that trembled but was steady in the way of people who have watched consequences and learned how to ferry them through. "Leave in 5 minutes," he said. "Drive until the sun finds you, don't stop, don't look in the mirror, don't say the name aloud." He didn't explain the why had been consumed by too many years and too many witnesses. I tucked the twine into my pocket like a small oath and walked to the door. The night pressed against the glass with a remnant of the hand smear, and the pumps looked like ritual objects now, not machines. Outside the gravel shifted once like an animal gauging its options, and then it stilled. When I walked to my car the engine turned on without a fuss and the headlights cut the desert into sensible pieces again. I did not look back at the glowing rectangle of the station. I drove until the oncoming light at the east began to flatten the black, and the desert, patient as ever, let me go. I climbed back into the car with the twine warm in my pocket and the clerk's words rubbing against the back of my skull like a prayer I couldn't swallow, and for the first few miles I drove as if obeying a rule I hadn't known existed, headlights fixed, hands light on the wheel, not daring to glance in the rearview mirror even once. The highway unspooled beneath me in a steady, obedient black ribbon and the desert on either side kept its ancient silence, an audience that had seen more farewells than welcomes. The sun lifted slowly, an indifferent hand erasing the sharpness of the night, and with daylight the world rearranged itself into something that felt safer by the inch. The roadside scrub looked like scrub again, the distant ridges like ordinary stone. Still, the memory of the smear on the window and the long shadow under the car sat in my chest like a pebble I kept moving around with my tongue, present, small, annoying, impossible to ignore. I stopped once in a town that still had a diner with a real coffee pot and bright enamel signs, and while the others in there were talking about work shifts and weather, my hands trembled as I poured more into my cup than I drank. more to keep my palms steady than to taste the warmth. When the woman at the next table asked, in that small, neighborly way people do, whether I was all right, I found myself giving the clerk's practiced answer, engine trouble, night, nothing to worry about. The lie felt polite and brittle and true all at once. People offer small explanations because they do not want to make room for the kinds of strangeness that settle like dust into a life. Days passed and the desert's touch loosened, as if daylight itself was a solvent for memory. I stopped flinching at every long puddle of shadow under an overpass, and when I passed stations that had pumps with bored attendants, I hardly looked. But the twine in my pocket kept its presence like an ache, gentle, constant. On a night 3 weeks later, when the moon was thin and the road was an honest black rib beneath my headlights, I found myself slowing at a station out of habit and not out of need, just to see whether the man in the coat waited in every place the road set tired lights. He wasn't there. The pumps were empty. The clerk waved at me like a man who had left his guard behind. I kept driving, feeling slightly foolish for having let a night unspool into a habit. Habit is a tricky liar. It binds you to good behavior until you forget why you picked it up in the first place. A good month went by and then a friend called with a story that made my stomach drop because it sounded like the ledger of the desert flipping a page. Her brother, mid-30s, good job, unreliable with rent but reliable with coffee, had driven out after an argument and didn't come back. Police had searched the stretch for days and come up with nothing but cigarette butts and tire tracks that led to nowhere. The family had stopped at every station along the route, left messages, called roadside towing companies, prayed in phone calls that made voices small. I felt the old tug immediately, an idiot's obligation to be useful, and I drove back out along the same ribbon of road where I'd nearly lost my breath weeks before. The landscape tasted of blue metal and dust, and when I slowed at the pump that night I watched the light and the glass the way someone watches a wound to make sure it hasn't closed up wrong. This time, the man in the coat was not a ghost of caution but an odd kind of constable. He stood at the far pump with his back to the highway, head bent just a little, like someone reading an invisible page. He didn't notice me at first, and I almost believed I had the luxury of distance, but then he shifted his weight and acknowledged me with the same small tilt he had given me before, and the clerk, same tired face, same practiced hand, moved like a man who had rehearsed this interaction 1,000 times. He offered coffee in the chipped pot, slid a small paper cup across the counter, and when I took it my fingers brushed his and for a beat the world seemed to hold still between us, the small currency of shared ritual. "You came back," he said, not a question. "Good." He didn't say why, the reason lived in the unspoken ledger. The man at the pump lifted a finger and pointed toward the scrub behind the pumps. I followed the line of his gesture and saw, half buried between gravel and a discarded tire, a shape of cloth that looked like it had been folded and left as a careless offering. I walked toward it because I had stopped refusing the work the desert seemed to hand out, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because the twine had taught me to be a witness, and when I brushed the fabric away a small face, pale and slack, looked up at me. Not dead in a theatrical way of movies but caught in a sleep that did not need breathing. I swallowed a sound that might have been a curse and pulled them up with the rough tenderness you reserve for people you do not yet know. The person was alive enough to blink and weep and to mutter incoherent fragments that smelled of miles and wind. They were confused, and they had been walking with the edges of their mind frayed. They told a story of blackness and dragging and the sensation of being followed by a thing with patient hunger. Their car was 50 yards down the road, empty and warm. The man at the pump watched everything with that same thin stillness, and when the person who had been lost found voice the first coherent thing they asked was, "Did I miss something?" as if they had misplaced time rather than property. The desert had returned someone and charged for the favor. A week from their memory had been traded, a small seam stitched closed at the price of a few ordinary facts. The rescued person could no longer name the color of their mother's kitchen tiles. The ledger had taken that one small, private fact as payment. They hugged me like a sinner grateful for absolution and then walked away with a listless gait, clutching a paper cup of too hot coffee as if it were a talisman. The man in the coat lifted his head, inclined it at me, and when I left the station I felt lighter and heavier in the same motion, relief that someone had been returned, but a new weight of responsibility settling over me like a promise I had accepted. After that night I understood the clerk's quiet better. The desert was not a place of random cruelty, it was a place of trades, and the currency was memory. Sometimes the returns were small mercies, a photograph, a ring, a child's toy, and sometimes they were the kind of mercy that rearranged the household ledger by stealing some tiny truth in exchange. The man in the coat, the so-called last passenger, was not an agent of violence so much as a marker. He pointed where the desert had decided to trade, and when people followed the pointing without a witness, they paid more than they expected. I began to think of the twine as less a charm and more a duty. I kept it knotted in my pocket and started doing small things that marked me as a witness. I wrote down names and dates when I handed things back. I asked for other people to be present when someone retrieved something lost, and I learned the strange ethics of such small transactions, the question to ask being not what price you are willing to pay but whether you can live with the shape of the debt. People were grateful, and they were also puzzled, because the ledger's recompense is never framed in a way you can explain at a barbecue. You cannot tell a neighbor, yes, your watch was returned, but now you will never remember the sound of the old floorboard, without watching their face fold in ways you can't mend. Months moved through that year like a slow procession. I lived a life that was now lightly marked by an awareness that some roads are not just geography but memory maps with strict customs. I drove late sometimes on purpose, not because I wanted to seek the desert's favors but because I wanted to be ready if something else needed a witness, and because watching had become a form of care I did not know how to stop performing. And once, very near dawn, I saw the man in the coat standing at a pump again, but this time he nodded to me with a gentleness that felt almost human, and I heard in that nod a permission I did not deserve. He wasn't there to scare anyone, he was there to point. The last passenger does not ask for company. He only points. And if you understand that point and refuse to follow it without witness, you might leave with your mind intact, keeping the small facts that make your life recognizable to you. If you do not recognize the point, the desert will rearrange you gently, pick a few small pieces that are only yours, and move them into its ledger. I still keep the twine knotted on my keyring. When I catch myself tempted to tell the story in full, I stop because some things are better witnessed than gone over loud. I will tell the truth of the ledger only to those who ask quietly and promise to be present. The desert is generous in its way. If you accept its terms you may get back what you have missed, but generosity there comes with a bill you cannot always pay in the currency you expected. So I drive with the windows up after dark, and when I pass a lonely pump with its tired neon flicker, I think of the man who points and the clerk who keeps the keys, and I remember to keep witness, say the name aloud when something returns, call another person to be there when the ledger is balanced, and do not stop unless you must. That is the only small mercy I have found that seems to matter in the end. I booked the room because it was the only place with a lit sign 2 exits after midnight, and when you've been driving for hours the light of a vacancy feels less like convenience and more like a small mercy. The motel sat an ungainly little block off the highway, its neon sign flickering the tired promise of a bed, and when I pulled into the gravel lot the office window was empty except for a man behind the desk who looked like he had learned to be polite because the job required it, not because he liked people. The hall smelled like old air freshener and cleaner that had been diluted until it had nothing left to say. My key was a plastic rectangle with the number stamped in a font that still insisted on being useful. They handed it to me with a half-skim of a smile and the exact rote line, "No pets, checkout is 11, like an incantation. The room was the kind that slides under your awareness and settles without fuss, thin drapes, a lamp whose switch stuck, a television that offered only 2 channels clearly and a dozen with static as if the building kept a private weather of interference. I remember thinking, as I set the little key on the nightstand, that motels are honest places, they tell you what they are and don't pretend to be anything more. That thought lasted all of 10 minutes. Sometime close to 2 in the morning I woke because the room felt wrong in a way that isn't loud. It's the sort of wrongness that rearranges the weight of the air until your lungs notice. The television was off. The lamp glowed faintly because I'd left it on, but the light seemed to have a softness that made shadows behave like they were keeping a secret. At first I blamed the half-sleep on the miles I'd driven. Then I heard the knock. Not at the door but from the small cabinet where the phone sat, a rhythmic, careful tap as if someone were rapping a knuckle against wood in a room down the hall. The motel phone is an old kind of instrument. You expect a call to the desk, for the office to pipe in a voice telling you about a wake-up or a wrong number. You don't expect a slow, patient rap from within your own room, from the place you think contains only what you brought into it. I told myself it was the heater, or a loose hinge, and I lay very still and listened. The tapping repeated 3 times. That's when I realized the sound had come from inside the cabinet, as if something small and mechanical had been stilled there and now decided to ask for attention. I got up and opened the cabinet. The phone lay there as always, the cord coiled like an obedient snake. No loose batteries, no note, nothing. I laughed at myself then, a dry, embarrassed sound, because exhaustion is volatile and it loves to dress as superstition. I shut the cabinet, told myself I'd probably dozed and made the noise with some movement, and crawled back into bed. When I woke again, the lamp was half out, the room dimmer in a way that made the corners gather closer. I saw, from the corner of my eye, the bed's shadow shift as if something had leaned against the headboard. When I turned, the motion stopped. That's the first rule of a small fear: it breeds small, plausible explanations until you begin to prefer them because they are gentler to carry. I let the lamp burn down until it was only a warm, cautious circle and drifted again, the kind of sleep where images hang on the edge of your waking and your dreaming. Morning arrived in the motel in a way that felt both too quick and too certain. Fluorescent light pours through thin curtains and sharpens everything like an accusation. I rose with the careful attention of a person unaccustomed to quiet safety. The bed was made with the neat economy of a job done by hands that have long since learned how to be efficient. On the nightstand, the plastic key still sat where I'd left it. I went to the sink and, with the private ritual of travel, ran my hands over my face and tried to wash the tiredness into meaning. Then I noticed the ledger on the small desk, a thin spiral notebook that had been there when I checked in. The previous names were scribbled and ordinary, but the last entry, the one at the very top, was recent, the handwriting small and tidy: room 12 left at 3:10 a.m. My skin tightened. I had not seen anyone leave at that hour. I turned the page and there was a tiny loop, the penciled residue of something someone had scratched and then pressed down. People keep notes in motel ledgers sometimes: numbers, complaints, a message to the person who might look next. This ledger felt like a record of attendance, as if the motel kept time in a different currency. I was on my feet before I realized I'd decided, moving with a quiet urgency that made even the lamp look like it was moving too slow. The hallway smelled like a dozen other hallways I had passed through in life: shoes rubbed on carpet, the faint trace of toothpaste, the exhaustion of other people's routines, but there was something else threaded into it that I couldn't name. The door to room 12 stood slightly ajar, a thin line of shadow where the seam ought to be sealed. I paused. The knob was warm. I told myself to knock, to be neighborly, to act like a person who respects privacy, but the kind of curiosity that takes you out of bed in the 2:30 morning instant doesn't ask permission. I pushed the door. Inside, the room looked like a room someone had left in hurry or in carelessness: a towel on the floor, a chair with a jacket slung over it, a coffee cup cooling half full by the nightstand, but there was no one in it. That absence should have been a relief. It wasn't. Propped on the pillow where a head should have been rested, facing up, was a small travel-sized mirror. Its surface had been dully polished except for a single, clean circle in the center, as if someone had pressed their eye to it and then lifted, leaving the rest fogged. And beneath the mirror, written on the sheet in a neat, deliberate scrawl: "We didn't leave." My mouth went dry. The sentence was neither pleading nor triumphant, it sat there like a fact. When I carried the notebook back to the office, the clerk didn't look surprised. His motions were the economy of someone accustomed to thin strangeness. He took the ledger, turned the page with slowly patient fingers, and his face folded in on a thought I couldn't read. "This place," he said finally, as if naming a tenant you've long tolerated, "sometimes forgets when people check out." He said it without melodrama. He told me that every so often someone would book, stay, and then, without fanfare, without leaving, no longer appear in the morning when the housekeepers made rounds. "They think they left," he said, "until the ledger says otherwise." I pressed for more because that is what loneliness with fatigue makes you do: you gather rumor into a shape you can carry. He told me about a woman who thought she'd driven away at dawn and later realized the motel had recorded her as present, about a man who returned at noon to find his key still in the drawer because he'd never actually checked back into the road. The clerk's hands trembled a little as he handed me a paper cup of coffee no one had asked for. "Keep the key on you," he said. "And if you see something odd, don't make it the center of your night. People forget they are missing." His advice landed in the room like a small ritual, an instruction to treat strangeness like a fragile object. I went back to my room holding the key like it was an ember, the ledger's words replaying in my head until I could taste their edges. I tried to tell myself logic: people come back, people go out for a smoke, people get lost in sleeping cities, but each rationalization was porous. The motel's walls felt thin, as if the building itself were a skin stretched over something larger and more patient. At 3:10 the hall lights blinked as if someone had passed and left only the echo of a body. I waited then, with a ridiculous politeness for the kind of night that asks to be noticed. Around 3:20 there came a soft scrape against my door. Not a knock, not a deliberate sound, but a curious little friction like fabric sliding along painted wood. I opened the door a sliver. In the narrow corridor the light pooled a certain way that made the carpet look like a river. At the far end, someone stood with their back to me. The shape was exactly the sort of thing you think will vanish if you look directly. It was a person-shaped shadow, shoulders rounding the kind of patience people carry when they have nowhere else to go. I felt my hands go warm in the pockets. I wanted to say, "Are you okay?" I wanted to say nothing at all. The shape did not move. It did not turn. It did not breathe audibly. There was a long, stupid temptation to step forward and ask their name, a childish desire for stories to resolve quickly in bright speech. I didn't. I stepped back, closed my door without a sound, and slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor with my knees drawn up, because sometimes small bodies shield themselves better than big ones. The next morning the clerk handed me my key back as if returning a found object. "You kept your room key last night," he said without looking at the ledger. My voice caught in my throat when I asked about the person in the hall. He seemed to study me kindly, the way someone studies a friend who has seen the edge of a thing and come back. "People linger," he said, "sometimes endings are slow." He didn't sound cruel, he sounded like someone who had a long memory and preferred it to be quiet. But the ledger kept saying things that logic couldn't arrange around. Over the next 2 nights the pattern folded into a small arc, doors left slightly open, a television as if paused mid-gesture, the feeling of someone sitting in a box of air beside you when there was nothing to sit on. I stopped leaving the key on the nightstand. I put it under my pillow like a talisman because somehow proximity felt like a defense. In the mornings I thumbed through the ledger and saw entries appear with the small regularity of a clock: room 12 present at 3:10 a.m. Room 12 present at 3:20 a.m. Someone, or something, was arranging to be noticed and then arranging, gently, to stay. The motel's air changed from indifferent to attentive. There is a peculiar terror in being watched by a place that has learned you. People are used to being observed by others because other people will eventually tell you what they saw. A building that remembers you doesn't speak as loudly. It keeps its ledger in faint pencil on the small spiral pages where names smudge and faces blur, and it demands a different kind of witness, not the loud, judgmental witness of crowds but the quiet, repeated noticing of someone who will call what happened by its name. I started to leave small things in the room: a coin, a paperclip, a plastic ring, objects with nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with proof. When the mirror on the pillow tilted, when the hairline crack in the lamp shifted and then repaired itself, I left the coin on the nightstand and went down to the office and told the clerk I saw it. He would nod and make a note, his pencil scratching a soft, precise line into the ledger. It felt ridiculous, bureaucratic even, to log the movement of whatever the motel did at night, but the act of writing made the feeling less like madness and more like record-keeping. By the 5th day the motel had a pattern that included me. I would wake because the room was not precisely as I'd left it, the bed would be slightly untucked, the television switched to a channel it had not been on before, the curtain leaning as if someone had studied the horizon. Each time I wrote it down. Each time the clerk accepted my note and made the tiny mark and closed the book. The entries gathered like small confessions until the ledger looked like a map of small vanishings and small returns. And then, one night when I had almost convinced myself that habit had bled into reality and that logic was only a shade, I woke to thunder in the room, a kind of soft, steady knocking from within the walls, as if the motel itself was calling roll. I opened my eyes and saw, clearly and without the filter of dream, a shadow standing in the corner of the room. It was the shape of a person, but the edges sat with the looseness of something not quite formed. It did not advance. It did not speak. Its presence was like a hand held at the back of your neck, gentle, persistent, impossible to shrug off. I sat up. It lifted a wrist as if offering me my key, which lay exactly where I had hidden it beneath the pillow. The motion was deliberate and strangely kind. In that reach I saw the faintest glimmer of a face that could have been young or old, male or female, a face that the motel had perhaps remembered and kept like a bookmark. I took the key. It was warm. The shadow nodded, and then it bent, slowly, and walked toward the door and, without sound, opened it. For a breath I thought it would leave. For a breath I thought my heart would break loose at having been so foolish as to imagine a parting. Instead, the shadow stepped into the corridor and paused. It turned as if to check that I was watching. The ledger is for recording, yes, but it also wants an audience. The shape slid down the hall and melted into morning like a tide rolling back, leaving the motel to its shallow day again. When I went downstairs, the clerk wrote the line with a soft, certain hand, room 12 checked out at 6:02 a.m. He looked at me over the ledger and said simply, "Sometimes it takes a witness for the place to remember to let someone go." I held the little plastic key between thumb and forefinger and felt, for the first time since arriving, a thin kind of satisfaction, an almost childish belief that noticing had matters that were practical and real. I asked him then, the question that had nested in me like a burr, if someone didn't have a witness, what happened? He made a small, bitter sound that might have been a laugh and said, "They stay in the margins until someone else needs to claim them back." He closed the ledger and slid it toward me as if offering a pact. I checked out that morning with the key in my pocket, my name in the register, and a ledger entry that matched what my eyes had seen. The motel would be there the next time someone drove too long, its neon sign blinking like a small, tired moon, and there would be a ledger and a clerk and a set of rules I had learned to respect. I drove away thinking that the world arranges itself in strange economies, memory for mercy, notice for freedom, and the distance between two towns never looks the same after you've held a key that a shadow handed you. I kept the coin I had left on the nightstand that week. It sits now in my drawer like a small check against forgetting, a reminder that sometimes places keep people because they think they are needed, and sometimes people must be taught to leave. I went into the Sierra because the city had begun to feel like a wound you keep prodding to see whether it still hurts, and mountains gave me the tidy lie that silence could fix things if you let it. The road narrowed as the afternoon retreated, pine after pine pressing inward until the world outside the windshield thinned into a narrow suggestion, and when I saw the hand-painted sign for the campsite I pulled off as if answering something I hadn't yet said aloud. It wasn't on any of the maps I kept on my phone. The path that threaded into the trees looked older than GPS, less a route than a memory someone had left open, and the clearing that opened up felt right in the way that solitary places feel right. One fire ring of stones, a bench bleached by years, a patch of earth flattened by tents pitched and packed by strangers who wanted only a night of sky. I set my tent with deliberate slowness because when a place offers you stillness like charity you don't unpack the moment with hurry, you let it settle. The light folded down quickly. By the time the fire was good, by the time the embers breathed and the first honest sparks popped, I felt like I had a private world. The trees stood like old men around a table, unbothered by the small bright circle I made for myself, and that night the mountains tightened the dark as if they were practicing being opaque. After a while, when the stars had rinsed themselves in the rim of the sky and the heat of the day slid away, my name arrived. It wasn't a whisper, not the clumsy echo a tired mind invents. My name sounded perfectly ordinary, said in a casual voice that had the friendliest possible edge to it, the tone someone uses when they want your attention but mean you no harm. It came from the tree limb, close enough that if anything lived there I should have seen it, but I saw only tree trunks and the slow, patient black between them. Of course at first I told myself the sensible things, an idle hiker passing, a neighbor's voice traveling oddly through the pines, fatigue making the world arrange itself into patterns. But the voice came again, twice, thrice, always my name, always in that same patient cadence. and with every repetition my feeling of being simply solitary narrowed into something sharper. I moved toward the trees, slow on my feet because the woods do not forgive clatter at night. The air held a metallic coolness that left my breath faintly visible and immediately very private. I expected to find boot prints, a flashlight, some trace that could be explained by bodies and shoes. There were none. Just the smell of crushed pine needles and a hush large enough to hold a name. I went back to the fire because moving toward the unknown felt like consenting to a story I hadn't chosen, and I sat until my hands were warm and the flame felt like something I could lean my worry against. The minutes collected themselves into a small ledger of sounds, a distant bird, the soft pop of the wood, an insect or two taking turns with loneliness. Then the footsteps started, not far off, but circling, paced, practiced, making the thin, dry rasp of human weight across pine duff in a rhythm that should have meant someone simply walking past. They moved close, close enough that the tent fabric trembled with the shadow of motion, and then they paused. The voice returned, softer now, as if satisfied I hadn't fled. The thing outside, whatever rang that cadence, did not talk to be scary. It talked to be recognized. It said my name the way you might say the name of a relative at the other end of a crowded room, intentional, familiar, almost intimate, and for a second I almost wanted to answer because manners do not die easily, even at the edge of strange fear. I didn't. I zipped in and sat with my back against the canvas, wondering how long I could keep a polite courage before it unraveled. Sleep did not come, the dark was patient and curious, and every time I let my lids drop the name would come again in the same ordinary voice. Around 2 in the morning the sound changed, it learned to echo my heartbeat. It no longer simply said my name. It began to misname me, close but wrong, trying on the sound of me like an ill-fitting coat. The misnames tugged at something private. The forest seemed to watch to see whether I would correct it, whether I would speak the exact syllable and thereby prove I still belonged to the person I thought I was. I kept my mouth shut. If the woods wanted to play with identity, I would not supply the rope. Dawn arrived thin and polite. Light in the Sierra is honest in a way cities are not. It does not flatter, it only reveals. When I finally climbed out of the tent, something lay arranged in the dirt like a deliberate offering, my things. Not strewn, not messy, but placed with a sterile exactness. Every object I'd put in my pack the night before now lined up in a careful row: my water bottle, the small pocket knife, a battery, a paperback book, socks folded the way my mom used to fold them. The thing that made my stomach drop was not the order but the presence of my ID card at the very end, propped upright and facing the tree-line as if it were a little altar. Whoever or whatever had moved these things had taken time. They had looked through the small interior of my life and put my name where it could watch the forest. I slid the ID into my wallet and wanted very much to leave then and there, to go as fast as the gravel would allow and never come back. But leaving felt complicated. The path out of the clearing looked slightly different than when I arrived, as if the trees had shifted positions by the width of a breath, and the road beyond the pines had a soft hesitation at its edge. The mountain air seemed to weigh agreement. I packed with the clumsy speed of someone pretending to be sensible. When I reached the path I thought led back to the highway, the forest made the first trick obvious. Distances had stretched in the night. A step that felt short now lengthened, trees that had been within arm's reach shifted like columns in a quiet theater. I walked until my calves ached and the sky thinned into long blue bands. Halfway back, the voice came again, not from beyond the trees but from inside the clearing I had left behind. It said my name the way someone might call a dog that has been apprenticed to obey. It carried no anger and no malice, only a patient insistence. The sound pulled on me like gravity, subtle and inexorable. The trees leaned to listen. I turned a single time and saw, through the trunks, a motion, fabric shifting where the tent had been folded, a suggestion that something had stood and then knelt. I did the sensible thing and walked faster, and then ran, and the path that had been long enough to curse became mercifully short in the sprint to the car. I did not look back until my taillight swallowed the last of the forest. I told myself I had been tired, that the mountains play tricks on solitary people. The rational mind builds fences quickly to keep fear from spreading. For 2 days I stayed in town, drank too much coffee, let the shops and the hum of other people's lives distract me. But when I opened my wallet at a gas station and found a single pine needle flattened into the plastic sleeve where my ID had been, and next to it a tiny smear of dirt that looked like a thumbprint I did not recognize, the ledger of the night returned to me in cold relief. The forest had kept my name clean and upright for itself, and kept a piece of me as a reminder. I drove home with the road long but my thoughts longer. That small, absurd memento sat like a stone I had pocketed against forgetting. I told nobody, because stories about names that call you from trees only make room in the world for people who want to believe the world is dangerous in a particular poetic way. I thought distance would dilute the thing's reach. I thought time would be a solvent that made memory less sticky. I thought the highway's constant motion would unclench the quiet the woods had left in my chest. None of those hopes held. 2 weeks after I left, the phone call came at an hour that felt like a cruelty, my voicemail blinking with my sister's number, and when I listened her voice was small and raw, saying, "Did you hear about the missing hiker?" And the voice on the news that night had the neutral cadence of official grief. "Truckers saw last at pull out 2 miles past the old lodge, no sign, no car, nothing." My heart did a cartwheel of guilt and a little, ridiculous pride, that I had noticed, both at once. I called friends, called police, called the ranger station because habit is a poor substitute for courage and because there are procedures. The ranger forced being practical. We search, we coordinate, we keep records. They asked me for details. I told them where I had camped, how the path had looked, the odd arrangement of my pack. There was a silence over the phone like someone comparing maps. Then the ranger said he'd send a couple of volunteers to the clearing tomorrow morning. I slept poorly, not because I expected to find anyone but because I had learned something ugly. The forest keeps things it considers useful. When the volunteers came back 2 days later, they were quiet in that particular way quiet people get when they've seen something that fits the shape of a place and does not fit it in any humane sense. They had found tracks. Sometimes the subject of search teams is the holes tracks leave in the world rather than a solitary body, and they had found items arranged in neat lines, like the things I'd found, but there were pieces that did not tally with any living list, an old photograph with the faces blurred as if the wind itself had been asked to forget, a child's shoe that looked washed and new though no flood had been near, and, more chillingly, the loose imprint of a thumb on damp earth where there had been no thumb in the daylight before. I watched them map things onto the ground with numbered flags and wore a stranger's patience around my jaw as if it would shore me up against some storm. The ranger kept his voice low and said that some places keep people's things as if expecting a payment, but he used the word trade and I heard tribute. He didn't use the word ledger, but a ledger is what it looked like when you stand close enough to the dirt and see the small columns of returned and taken. That night I dreamt the forest's voice was a chorus, many small iterations of my name layered into something like music. It did not feel malicious in the way haunted houses do, it felt administrative, procedural, like bureaucracy with moss on it. When I woke I found my phone showing a missed call from a number I didn't recognize, and a text that read only one word, witness. No signature, no joke, just the small imperative to be present. I hadn't told anyone, not even my sister, about the twine of order the campsite had shown me, about the row of belongings, the upright ID, the neatness, but here was a request someone or something had sent me in a crisp odd way. I debated whether to answer. Whether to be complicit in a ritual I didn't understand. In the end I drove back. This time I did not take the path that had guided me in. I parked the car a fair distance and hiked into the clearing without saying my name and without staking a claim. The tent remained upright and perfectly arranged as I had left it the morning I fled. The fire ring was cold, the bench slick with dew. At the center of the clearing something, had placed a circle of small stones in a pattern that looked, absurdly, like a seat. Inside that ring, arranged like offerings, were things I recognized and things I did not. A locket with glass so clouded the face inside was only suggestion, a bus ticket from a city 2 states away, a child's marble with the swirl of a storm trapped inside, and at the very center, my wallet opened and emptied save for a single corner of an ID peeking up from the soil like a tombstone. I kept my distance and I watched. The forest around me held its breath with the deliberation of someone who sits through long, dull meetings. Then something moved in the trees, not a step, not a shadow that grows from wind, but a slow, intentional parting of branches that made a corridor of darkness. I felt the small sound of a foot placed on old soil. The voice spoke, but not in the way I had known before. It was layered, an arrangement of tones that sounded like the voices of other people I'd met in my life, my father's chuckle, a woman's precise clarity, a childhood teacher's admonishment, each borrowed and stitched as if the wood's voice had been gathering sounds for years. It called me not by the name on the ID but by variant forms, affectionate and inaccurate, a nickname used by an ex, a childhood mishap name, the syllable my uncle used when he teased me. It didn't ask to be answered. It asked for witness, it asked for company, as if the very presence of being named aloud would finalize an exchange the forest wanted to make. I said nothing. Instead I reached into my pocket, found a small twine, kept like a stupid charm since the first night, and I tied it around a stone at the lip of the ring. It felt like an oath in an old language. Then the pattern unfolded, where the twine looped the stone, something in the soil loosened, the subtle tension that had hollowed the clearing all week seemed to hesitate like a string being plucked. A sound rose, not audible so much as felt, a faint vibration low in the bones. From the nearest cluster of trunks a figure moved into the thin corridor, no grand entrance, nothing cinematic, just a body appearing in the space not by stepping forward but by leaving a place where it had been waiting. It was not wholly human in the way it filled the light, limbs longer, shoulders a little too angular, face clear enough to register that it had a mouth and eyes and the same tired ineffable patience as the voice, but also wrong in that some edges softened like candle wax. It looked at me with an interest that felt older than kindness. "You kept your name," it said, but the voice carried as many layers as the wind, and the syllables had the weight of someone delivering news both routine and important. My mouth wanted to protest with logic, with city words about boundaries and property. Instead I found myself asking what nobody should have to ask a forest: "What do you want?" It tilted its head. "We collect what people leave," it said, and for a moment its eyes were like small stones reflecting a tired sky. "We keep pieces until the account is balanced." It spoke not in malice but as an accountant might recite figures. Sometimes people do not notice what they owe, sometimes they go and leave you to make the payment. Payment for what? I said, my voice staunch under the enormity of a question I hoped would be small. "For forgetting," it said plainly. "We return a thing, and you give us a fact." It gestured with a hand that left faint rings of moss in the air, and the examples spun out like small exchanges: a locket returned and a lullaby's tune lost, a watch returned and a street name erased from memory. "You call that exchange merciful," it added. "We call it balance." The sight of the ledger made a shape in my head, that concrete, awful bookkeeping of human detail traded like currency, and I felt suddenly both small and absurd. "Why me?" I asked. "Why my name?" "I didn't ask for anything." "You listened," the creature said simply. "You were present when we called. Presence matters. We prefer witnesses who remember to mark the trade." It did not sound congratulatory, it merely stated the mechanics of it. "You may leave with less," it added, "or you may keep but owe still. The ledger is patient." I thought about the ID in my pocket, the pine needle in the plastic sleeve, the thumbprint that didn't belong to me. I thought about the people who never found the missing, about the pairs of losses that never matched in any reasonable way. I thought about being thankful for the things that had come back to me and how grateful that gratitude might blind me to other subtle vanishings. The creature tilted its head as if reading my thoughts and then stepped back. "We are not cruel," it said. "We are tidy." The word tidy sounded like a verdict. I left that day empty-handed in the mundane way of a man who had not been robbed and also not entirely intact. I did not run so much as I moved with the slow sense of a person who understands there will be small deductions in his account and that living will require naming them. I drove away and kept the twine, now frayed and smelling of pine, on my keyring like a talisman that reminded me of the pact. I have not returned. Sometimes, when I pass roadside stands or campgrounds, I check my pockets and find things moved a little from where I left them, an odd coin shifted, the feel of a name at the edge of my tongue I cannot quite pull into the light. I say the names I remember aloud sometimes when I am alone in the car, not because I believe in counter curses but because the act of saying is the only audit I have found to keep the ledger balanced. The forest, patient as it is, calls its debts in patient cadence. If you hear your name in a place that is supposed to be empty, answer only to the degree you are willing to be priced. That much, the creature had made me understand, was the only real mercy it offered. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.